So we've got the picture on the front here of this full plan. So who'd like to start us off with any comment on it, any criticism of it, anything that you think is missing, anything that you would say this is really important for operational managers to know? So what you got?
I have a question before we even go any further is,
Yeah.
I guess we're looking at this, that these are people that are people, but they could be left brain process people that don't have those people skills at all. And
Yes.
So that's, to me, the big pressing question. How do you teach them, or how do you help them to have the skill set that they're not naturally inclined to have?
That's
It's
a
almost like
really
a
fascinating point.
precursor, isn't there? Like before you come into this, it's that where are
Yeah.
they
Where are
on
they?
that maturity journey?
Right.
Yeah. Where are they? What is their perspective?
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are they somebody that's, well, they're going to have, and I've met with managers like that. I've met managers that say, well, they're going to have to do because I said so. And then I've met managers that say, ignore this because it's just the next sparkly thing and it'll go away. I mean, both sides, where they don't want to help at all, or they want to force their people. There's no people skills in there. In other words, there's no working the team.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. It's about that recognizing that positioning. So we're starting here with recommendation is really a coaching conversation, isn't it? To understand their perspective, their situation. We can use this to advise them of all the work involved, but and I think my take on what you've just said is that if you've got somebody who is a people person, that a more empathetic piece, you might very well be able to talk to them about how people want to vent their feelings. If you've got somebody who's far more process based, I think being able to show them what kind of activities, what kind of plan, some kind of process approach might be your good starting point. I don't know about the rest of you, but I think it's really excellent point. You're starting with a coaching conversation. You're starting, if you're going to be supporting an operational manager, it's getting them to recognize maybe where they are. And I think the difficulty, one of the difficulties is they don't know what they don't know.
I think that's where it becomes almost like a change leadership session, doesn't it? And you can offer it as a sort of refresher, because some people will do it completely naturally, but some people will think, oh crap, do I really have to do that stuff?
Exactly.
I think it might be, it might be worthwhile just introducing. I think it's a really good point, just to kind of level the ground a little bit and make people really aware of what their role is.
Yeah. And I think when I face situations now where they don't know what they don't know, I'm much more inclined these days to just get people to sort of either, what are all the questions you'd like to ask about this subject? But I have started using ChatGPT as an activity to say, right, okay, whatever the situation, like I've got to lead my team through the adoption of S4 HANA or whatever it might be. Ask ChatGPT, what are the most common questions about making this change? And actually putting those up and saying to people, right, here's a list of 10 questions. We can talk through these. Please vote on the ones that most resonate with you. So you ask everybody to sort of maybe do a 1, 2, 3 prioritization, or just to pick one that is their most popular. But any kind of voting tools puts them back in the driving seat. But I've put up a series of those 10 questions, because if you don't know what you don't know, you don't know what you want to ask. But I think when people put a series of questions in front of you, go, oh, that's actually a good one. I want to, tell me about that. And by putting the voting tools in, you can get people to sort of really set the agenda of, as Jenny's just said, that leadership session. And in doing that, it's less of a tell and more of a they're pulling information out of us, I think. Something like that. Yeah.
Let people self-assess for their own change leadership skill, you know, just so that it doesn't look like you're saying, actually, you're not very good at this, you know. What elements of competencies that you need to be a good change leader are you good at, and which would you like a little bit of coaching on? Yeah.
I think there's some, yeah, I mean, there's an extension, isn't there, of that sort of putting up 10 questions of things you might want to know. And I think there's an alternative view of that, something they can do in a far more reflective way, which is giving them some kind of self-assessment tool, which is not beyond the bounds of us. I do one for sponsors where I do basically a questionnaire. And whenever I have done it, it's been so impactful because you can see it. I've done it in the room sometimes where I've given them a printed copy and you can see them having that moment of discovery where I have listed out all the questions about, are you comfortable doing this? Are you comfortable doing that? And you can see the sort of the moment of discovery and think, I've got to do that. I've got to do this. Are you the best person for this? And actually, there is something about that kind of self-assessment tool, that sort of questionnaire of the things that it's formed of, the things that we really need that role to perform, and get them to grade themselves or identify the things that they are happy to do and the things that are not happy to do. So I think you can take it further than just put up the 10 questions and which ones do you want us to talk about in this session. You can go further, can't you, in a self-assessment way of doing it. But I want to come back to Vicky's point, because I think it's a really interesting one about my fear. As I think as our change profession, we start to move into coaching for change skills. So we were drawn to this world because we enjoy the people aspect. We enjoy coaching people through into new ways of working. As we ourselves are being drawn more into a coaching role, my fear is that we are drawn more and more into almost what Vicky's saying about people versus process people. It's almost as if we're drawn into, I've got to coach leadership skills. And as soon as you start talking about leadership skills, there's such a breadth of areas that I worry that we lose our change specificity. And I don't know if anybody else has that concern, but it worries me that I'm going to be put in an almost impossible coaching situation. Any views? Anybody else having a similar experience? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say it's an interesting one, Mel, because I don't feel like we can get away from that. You know, it's
not
it's
completely,
fascinating, isn't it? I think dealing with senior leaders and managers at every level, right? I think it's a huge part of our role to coach them through that. And maybe the question's also partly around how much of the actual formal skill building of that do you take on as a change practitioner versus the coaching? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting question there about if we want to retain some kind of doable scope, because coaching somebody to be a fantastic leader could be a life's work. I'm certainly thinking of somebody who is not a people person. He's not exactly warm, and he is very much of what Vicky would say is, well, just do it. I'm the boss. Don't bother me with your questions. Just get on and do it. And so coaching that person into being a more empathetic people person is clearly something that his wife has failed to do. So why has it suddenly become my problem? So there is something there about how about if I want to keep it focused, that maybe a guidance for us as change professionals is we keep it focused to the change situation, the specific change that we are doing. So I think that's where Vicky, that whole people bit could get way too wide. And I think there's something about, I'm going to coach you to do this change. maybe.
Yeah.
I think where you come back to the self-assessment piece as well is where you can concentrate, so you can say, okay, there are a dozen change competencies within change leadership. A great change leader has a dozen different competencies. Maybe 3 of those they need some help with. So it's just about kind of trimming. But also, if you do find that there's a massive gap, that's when you start talking with HR and learning and development about bringing in training for all managers. And because it's going to benefit you at the end of the day, the more legacy of training and coaching that you leave, the better equipped those people are for the next change.
You're such a reasonable human being. You're basically saying I shouldn't be going to HR saying fire them now, all hope is lost. You're looking for something more encouraging, aren't you?
It's true.
It depends.
Sometimes you should, Mel. Sometimes you should.
You want to say, look, they're not a decent human being. I think, to be honest, they're heading towards being a psychopath. Maybe this is the time that we cut ties before we find them, that there's a whole load of bodies in the garden. That would be poor. I mean, I'm managing the reputational risk of the organisation,
There are people, Mel, that you'll find that they don't want to get rid of because they're like a really good accountant or they're a really good systems manager. And they kind of think to themselves, they're really, really good at that job. And I don't want them to be a change person. I want them to be a good finance manager and I want them to be a good systems manager. And the fact their brain isn't wired to actually talk to people at all doesn't bother me. So maybe it's just focusing on what they need to do for that particular change and coaching them to help you to help them on that particular change, and just accept that they're never going to be good with people.
I think you know who I'm referring to. But so here's then the get out as well, then going back to Jenny's point about using that self-assessment to be able to target some of the areas, and also using the specifics of the change, the culture of the organization, the timetable for the change, the outcomes of the change, to really hone in on what we need to coach for. I think my other get out clause, when perhaps they have absolutely no personality at all, is that comes back to change agents and actually encouraging them to. I was with somebody today who was absolutely flabbergasted by the idea of this. They'd never heard of this idea of a change agent network before. But as I described the fact that they've got a whole load of people who make money for their company, they're in the sales team, and they are extremely worried about asking them to get involved in the change at all. They want to keep, they started the morning by saying we've got to do the change to them, because we can't possibly pull them out of the business to get them involved, because otherwise they're not selling to our customers and our revenue will go down. And so I started talking about the sort of change agent network and this idea of, having the odd point person out of all of these salespeople that really takes on and can coach their colleagues through this, so that would enable them to drip feed change through, so that they're not going to have maybe a big time out from selling, because we're going to drip through changes on a more agile way, so they can keep servicing customers but keep evolving the service they deliver to customers. And that makes me think that with that kind of leadership I was talking with this morning, who are absolutely wedded to the keep everybody away from the change, just use a project manager, get it done and move on, that maybe the change agent network or those point people that are local, and that maybe are volunteering because they perhaps are interested in people, might be a get out as well. That could be a get out clause that we could use. Yeah. Jenny, back to you.
Oh, I think I'm going to just lower my hand, because I think, yeah, it was the point you made, Mel, and I'll just put something in the chat. I think, if you've got, we get people all the time who are just never going to be any good despite coaching. So yeah, just go somewhere else, and usually they will be more than happy to nominate somebody on their team who will be their voice and be that people person. So I think it's just, it's never lost. You just, as we all do, swim, navigate it until you get to the right people.
I think there's something here about if we're in this sort of situation, it's about perhaps drawing to people's attention the amount of time and energy required and all of the communication activities required, and that helping them to see that perhaps drawing somebody else into that role while they maintain their subject matter expertise can be incredibly valuable, so that we're preserving, if you like, their honour, whilst we are still able to sort of move on to that. But that conversation all came from the point, which is perhaps we ought to find out their situation first. Okay, let's look further down this plan then. Anybody else got any things that they think that's missing, or we need to be doing that, or what else could we add to this? So what else would we say? Or any timings we can put on that. As I said, I gave an example of a team of 10, and my basic rule of thumb is that, there's going to be at least 1 hour for each team member, and there'll always be a couple, going back to Roger's innovation adoption model, there'll always be a couple of laggards who probably need a second round of one-to-ones. So I'm always looking at, 12 to 15 hours for every team of 10 I've got. Yeah. Tracy.
Mel, I was just thinking, I think you've got it covered almost under like tracking progress, but there's a piece for me here, and I'm just gonna think ProSci for a second, think ADCAR, just one example, right, or one tool. But there's something for each and every people manager to be consciously thinking through, where are my people at this point in time, and therefore what needs to happen next. So when I've been working with managers in the past, I've taught them about that kind of ADCAR principle. And then I've said, this is where you want people to be in each of these different phases. And where do you think they are? Because that way, and the reason for that is to say, as a change person on a piece of work, or one of my team members on a piece of work, we don't work with their team every day. So they're the closest. So they know, whether awareness is an issue, or whether design is an issue, or whether the knowledge isn't there yet, for example. They've got a huge role to play around that reinforcement piece, right? And that, selling that change to their people. So I think it's covered under track progress, right? That it's literally, do you know where your folks are? Can you then link in with me, and I'll help you, with some interventions that'll help move them or help you work out what those are. But you need to make that assessment, because it's much easier for you than it is for me.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I think I like the idea of giving that structure to, if we know what tracking progress might mean, but I think what Tracy's saying is that we make that far more explicit, so that people can see what the journey is, and that they can try to identify, well, where are we, and also where should we be. So there's something in there, isn't there, about that tracking progress, making that journey that's so obvious to us more explicit to other people. Yeah, I really like that. Laura, over to you.
Hello. I think one of the conversations that we had in our group about the model was, maybe I felt that perhaps it was a danger of being a bit too linear for the modern change environment, by which I mean that obviously, I think all of us in our group were reflecting, we can't remember the last time that we had the luxury where you were working on an individual change, and that managers were managing an individual change, and that team members were assimilating an individual change. And so I think it's, once you add kind of multiple layers of change onto this, it becomes kind of more difficult, I think, to manage. And I think more about kind of embedding those change leadership skills in general, and kind of joining our role as change managers, kind of joining up the dots for people and contextualizing change for people, and helping managers to contextualize change for their teams. Because otherwise, it would be really great if it was like, 10 to 15 hours and you're done. But it's just not life in most organizations, is it? It's like 10 to 15 hours on change X, 10 to 15 hours on change Y. Oh, and there's change Z over there coming down the tracks. That's another 10 to 15, you know, so it's how we join that up for people.
I think there's something in there that when you were speaking it, I made a note that there's a question to be answered, which is, why do I feel so confused? Well, you can replace the word confused with overwhelmed if you like, but I think it comes back to it's multiple simultaneous change, all at different states of change. So going back to Tracy's comment about within tracking progress, there's almost that this is where I want people to be, but we're talking about being knocked off course all the time by other changes that are feeling overwhelming, that will impact the motivation for any other change. Discovering that there's more work to be done, that actually I need to consider how that change is going to work before I can make decisions on this change, that typical interdependencies piece. So I think there's something in there around, why do I feel so confused, or why can't I see? I think something we have all accepted in our practice is just what Laura said. Why can't I see a straightforward linear path through this? We know that it shouldn't be a straightforward linear path because that doesn't make any sense anymore. But I think helping people to recognize that that is the issue. Why do I feel so confused? Because actually it's not a nice straightforward path. That actually whatever that you're planning to talk about with a particular change, don't forget that you've got to look up, sideways, down, and how that connects before you move on to the next bit. I really like that. I think there's something in there around that, back to that coaching conversation. And I'm not going to pick up that coaching conversation, that situational conversation from a standing start, am I? I'm going to be picking up from they're in the middle of a whole load of other changes. So I think there's something to be said there about, you know, what's your specific situation? One of the key questions is, what are all the other changes that your team's involved in at the moment? How do you feel they're coping? How are you coping with the volume of change? Can you see a clear picture of how the different changes are linked together? Those are all really good questions, which I think would kick off the, no, not really, got any ideas how I might do that? I was with the board of L'Oreal for several hours a couple of weeks ago, where I was put on the spot for several hours about how to run multi-billion-pound corporation whilst doing transformational change. I was with a professor from the London School of Economics as well, and they just fired questions at us. But it was really interesting that the bit that, as then these are board members and very, very capable people, but the question that they kept coming back to is, how do we find out where we are? You know, there was one of the board members talked about sort of climbing the mountain of change, and in the end she kept alluding to that, and in the end I had to say, no, I'm sorry, I think it's a mountain range, not a mountain. And as soon as I said that, the rest of them went, oh yeah, I get that now. Because I sort of said, you get up one mountain and you realize you've got to take everybody to the next and the next and the next. And you're a bit overwhelmed because you don't know how many mountains are in the mountain range. And you don't know if it's gonna, if you've climbed the highest mountain yet, or if there's, or the most difficult one, or if there's more difficulty to come. So we ended up in a long-winded conversation about that. So I think there's something in there around, why do I find this so difficult? That's really great. Thank you. Jenny, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's a huge thing, isn't there, about change portfolio management, you know, everything, so many questions push back up to that, you know, so why are we doing this again? You know, should we be doing this now? And, you know, how do you, people need to understand how things are prioritized and how initiatives are chosen and how others are not. But I think, yeah, just coming back to, and that was really well summarized, Laura, I think. Rebecca made the point in our group as well about, you know, all of this depends, right? So she works for a small charity. So, you know, there's like a team of 6 people maybe, where in other organizations you'd have 25, including 3 BAs and Lord knows what else. And I think the joining up thing for me is there are loads of practical ways that we can make that happen by, for instance, joining up with other change managers around other initiatives to say, right, if you need these people from team A, can we just get together and make sure we've got like one afternoon where we can get all of the information out of them that we need, just making sure that, you know, they haven't got a dozen people from a dozen initiatives knocking on their door. And I do think that's the onus is on us to try and make that efficient.
Yeah, yeah, I think that, yeah, I think this is important. We put all of this in the context of multiple simultaneous change. We'll do the last comment over to Vicky, and then we'll just finish up.
Having done a portfolio change management, I agree with you, Jenny. That's a really important point. One of the things I know that helped me was going with human-centered design, because then I'm putting a face to the people being impacted by groups, and they begin to see it stacking. You know, like, oh gosh, this particular pool of developers has this much going on with AI, and this group over here has this much going on with comms. And I mean, besides using tools, you know, that can help to have a visual to it, it really has helped me to come back to that point. Look at your people, you know, kind of by giving them a persona that actually has a face, it starts to change the way they're looking at it rather than pushing out. How about who's getting hit?
I think that's really, really helpful. It is, yeah, we've got to look at it in an empathetic way about, from a human perspective, what it's doing to people's workloads, people's view of their job in an AI-enabled world. I think that's going to become more and more of an issue. Why do I work here then? What am I doing? Because all the systems around me seem to be doing a lot of things. But I just come back to that point. Multiple simultaneous change. Maybe one of the key things we need to answer is, why do I feel so confused? Why am I finding this so difficult to grasp? So yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Laura, for making that point. Really helpful. Okay, what I'm going to do is just wanted to emphasize a couple of points. That there is free group coaching every 2 weeks for about 45 minutes, around about 12:45 each day on a Friday, alternate Fridays. So do have a look there. I've given you the link, and we've got something coming up in March, which is around what measures prove that my change activities create benefits. So we're going back. We know how incredibly popular the measures conversation is. So we're doing it yet again with yet more examples, because we know that's key skill building. But there's a plea from me now, is that Jill and I founded and run this network for the benefit of everybody. I would be so grateful if you could start sharing with your network the link to this group and to link to these events, because we do need help in getting the message out there all of the time. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you have a very, very good evening or afternoon, wherever you are. Take care, guys.